The Black Renaissance was a cultural movement, with the Harlem Renaissance being a large piece of that movement. The Harlem Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century. As a result of this social and artistic explosion that lasted roughly from the mid 1910s through the mid 1930s, this was a period considered the golden age of African American culture, manifesting itself through literature, art, theater, and music. This is One Mic, a Black History podcast. I'm your host, Country Boy, and if you can't already tell, this episode is about the Black Renaissance, specifically the Harlem Renaissance. As always, if you like this, you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page so I can continue to bring you dope content. Also, review us on Apple Podcasts, give us 5 stars so we can blow up. And lastly, check out The Cut for all your black pop culture needs. In 1911, the center of black life in New York was downtown section of Midtown Manhattan called Black Bohemia. This was an area that ranged from 27th Street to 53rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. Black Bohemia was pretty much a ghetto for African Americans, caused by using a variety of methods, including racial steering by realtors, redlining by lenders, restrictive covenants, violence, and white flight. Whites successfully isolated the growing black population within Midtown Manhattan in an area that was tightly packed and overcrowded with people, boarding houses, and apartment tenements. At this time, the average black worker earned around $7 a week, with small 4-bedrooms apartments in Black Bohemia costing almost $20 a month to rent. This was $2 to $5 more expensive than neighboring white neighborhoods and left black families with very little to live on. In addition, Black Bohemia was prime location for the city's brothels, gambling dens, because white landlords preferred them to regular tenants because they didn't demand much and were more willing to pay higher rent. In contrast, Harlem seemed like paradise with well-paved, tree-lined streets and beautiful brownstones and apartment houses. Harlem earned its reputation in the 1880s when developers envisioned this upper-class white haven far from the hustle and bustle of downtown Manhattan. In the 1880s, the elevated railroad built along 8th Avenue opened up mass transportation to the west side of Harlem. Next, the subway was scheduled to be built under Lenox Avenue on the east side by 1904. This caused a sudden boom in development, and investors invested an enormous amount of capital into Harlem with dreams of a flood of upper white middle class commuters migrating to the area. But what really happened is Harlem quickly became overbuilt years before the completion of the subway. By 1902, whole apartment buildings remained unoccupied while they waited for the flood of white tenants. Investors facing financial ruin chose money over racial prejudice. While Black Bohemia was well over capacity, a man by the name of Philip A. Payton Jr. recognized how desperate white owners of apartment buildings in Harlem really were. In 1903, Payton negotiated a deal with white landlords to lease a few houses above West 134th Street, east of Lenox Ave. He knew that middle-class blacks would pay anything to get out of the overcrowding in Black Bohemia. So he offered the landlords rental rate above the depressed price, and he added a percentage for himself. He was still able to offer apartments at a reasonable price because of the high rent in Black Bohemia. With the door crack, Payton was given more properties to manage, first on the west side and then across Lenox Ave. It was the beginning of a wholesale migration from Black Bohemia to Harlem. As African Americans began to move to Harlem, the current white residents became fearful of their neighborhood would soon become overrun with blacks, and as a result, they organized holding companies to buy properties adjacent to black apartment buildings. They also created the Hudson Realty Company with one mission of purchasing buildings that housed blacks and evicted them. In addition, they created an organization called Property Owners Protective Association Incorporated, which started out with the plan to get rid of colored people and prevent Negroes from coming to Harlem. Their president, John G. Taylor, told the Harlem Home News that he would work to make it impossible for white renegades to borrow any more money with the purpose of backing Negro speculators in their value-destroying ventures. Outraged, blacks fought the white resistance in every way they could. Philip Payton organized the Afro-American Realty Company to buy and lease houses for rent to African-American tenants, while other African-Americans made it a point to buy Harlem property, dispossess the whites, and install black tenants. Despite this, whites fought hard to exclude blacks, and the real estate publication spoke of the invasion of Harlem and suggested that the only place fit for blacks was in some colony on the outskirts of the city where their transportation and their problems would not inflict injustice or disgust on worthy citizens. The pressure applied to the Afro-American Realty Company by the Property Owners Protective Association Incorporated made it impossible for it to survive. The company could not acquire mortgages from banks, and the leases it did have were canceled, and the company's capital alone was not nearly enough to keep it above water. Enraged by the company's failure, Philip A. Payton Jr. decided to give white residents of Harlem a taste of their own medicine and entered into a partnership with C.J. Thomas, a prosperous undertaker, to buy 2 5-story apartment buildings to evict the white tenants and install black tenants. And another real estate firm formed by 2 other salesmen from the African American Realty Company, Johnny Nail and Henry C. Parker, they bought a row of 5 apartment buildings, also evicting the white tenants. Next, they would work with the Philip Protestant Episcopal Church, one of the oldest and richest African American congregations in New York, to buy a row of 13 apartment buildings on 135th Street between Lenox and 7th Ave. The church also evicted all the white tenants and rented the apartment buildings to blacks. By 1910, the tensions between white and black communities in Harlem was beyond repair. With the slums of Black Bohemia as the only alternatives, blacks doubled down their efforts to move into Harlem. They not only continued to rent apartment buildings outside of the segregated zone east of Lenox Ave, but also began to purchase fine private dwellings west of 7th Street. Whites responded to this invasion by completely abandoning the neighborhood. House after house, apartment building after apartment building was just left deserted. White owners that resisted selling to blacks suffered the most. While they were able to resist, their neighbors did not. Soon, these white owners had nothing but empty buildings because their white tenants had moved and they had to sell at prices well below market value. Ironically, by the time of the first Great Migration, Harlem was a very popular destination for migrants, and real estate in the area began to skyrocket. By the 1920s, estimates placed the total Negro ownership in Harlem at $200 million. That would be almost $1.8 billion today. During the 1920s, black pride surged as new race consciousness centered on self-worth emerged in all walks of black life. When the United States entered World War I, W.E.B. Du Bois called on African Americans in the crisis to forget their special grievances and stand shoulder to shoulder. And now it's time to receive what's rightfully theirs as full citizens of the United States. This change in African Americans' way of thinking manifested itself on a national stage, in particular in the worlds of music, art, theater, and literature. For generations, African Americans had been active in these cultural fields, but their emergence appeared sudden because they were outside of the mainstream. But before their emergence in the mainstream, African American art had been assimilating itself into American culture without conscious acknowledgement. Plantation songs, ragtime, blues, jazz were embraced on a national stage, and folklore like Uncle Remus and other plantation tales were appropriated in the newspapers and bedtime stories. This open expression of authentic blackness was the feeling of racial validation that African Americans hungered for. One of the books that set the stage for this artistic explosion of expression was Jean Toomer's Cain. Cain was one of the first books published by the white establishment that depicted black characters and culture as authentic instead of caricatures. Writer James Weldon Johnson would explain that no people has ever produced great literature and art and been looked upon as distinctly inferior. The state of the Negro in the United States was more of a question of national mental attitude towards the race than actual condition, and nothing would do more to change the mental attitude and raise the status than demonstrate the intellectual parity of the Negro through the production of art and literature. This assertion characterized the sentiment among Black writers in the early 20th century who based their stories on a raceless literature that demonstrated how little Blacks differed from whites, and literature that raised African Americans' intellectual status on a level on par with whites. Black author George Schuyler wrote an article called The Negro Art Hokum, an article that discounted the existence of Negro art, arguing that African American artists shared European influences with their white counterparts and therefore were producing the exact same kind of work. In response to this, Langston Hughes penned The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. In it, he described Black artists rejecting their racial identity as the mountain in which stands in the way of true Negro art in America. He declared that instead of ignoring their identity, we younger artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. The Black experience in white culture was so profoundly different from the white experience. Blacks simply did not have the same freedoms or opportunities. This is what made writers like Langston Hughes and Gene Toomer so powerful, with their ability to express the authentic Black experience rooted in issues of Black life, but also involving universal things of all people. This uniquely Black perspective was reflected throughout the Harlem Renaissance. Now that Harlem was crowded with talent and creativity, all that was needed was a spark, and that's when Charles Spurgeon Johnson comes in. Johnson was not an artist himself. He was a sociologist who made a name for himself with his work in racism. In 1923, he wanted to take his study into application by combating racism in real life. Johnson was convinced that Blacks and whites would someday live in harmony. He believed that Blacks and whites would finally cut across racial lines and eventually undermine all the barriers of racial segregation and caste. He had a visionary idea that whites would accept and appreciate Blacks simply by hanging out with them, and he worked tirelessly on this mission by promoting and publishing Black artists during the Renaissance and afterwards. Langston Hughes would state that Johnson did more to encourage and develop Negro writers in the 1920s than anyone else in America. As the founder and editor of the National Urban League's Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, Johnson was determined to help Black writers and artists gain recognition beyond the boundaries of Harlem and the Black community. Johnson soon found that publishing work of African Americans in the Opportunity and waiting for readers to discover them was way too slow. He wanted results more quickly, and he knew that authors' publication in the Opportunity would never guarantee mainstream success, much less break down the barriers of the white publishing world. He watched writers struggle to get by with low-paying jobs. Langston Hughes, for instance, made a living as a busboy while writing his poems that appeared in the Opportunity and the NAACP's The Crisis. So with the weight of the Urban League and the Opportunity, he started writing contests with substantial prizes of $100 or more. These prizes brought publicity to Harlem writers, but more was needed to establish these important artists in the minds and wallets of the white community. So in 1924, Johnson began to plan a literary coming out party that would get together white editors and publishers in the same room with Harlem writers. Initially, he used the publication of Jesse Faust's first novel, There Is Confusion. But the event quickly evolved beyond one writer's book party into a full-scale celebration of African American literature called the Civic Club Dinner. The dinner was set for March 21st, 1924. The appointed master of ceremonies for the affair was the scholar Allen Locke. He served as a mentor to several of the writers recognized at the dinner, and many were looking to him to further intellectual leadership to a new generation of Black writers and artists. Locke would draw the line between the literary past and the future, and he used the dinner as an opportunity to thank the veterans of the African American writing community like W.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson for the literary contributions that they made to younger writers. The dinner set the literary world on fire with writers such as Langston Hughes, Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, who were not even at the dinner left feeling like they would now find interest and support in the pursuit of their work, while older artists had their efforts affirmed by powerful editors and publishers of the New York book and magazine world. The excitement translated into a number of new publications that celebrated Black men and women in the Harlem Renaissance. Johnson would also enlist Alan Locke as the editor of a special issue of Survey Graphic called Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. And nearly every writer of importance to the Harlem Renaissance was included. And he didn't stop with one publication. He went on to do another one called Black and Topaz, which would attempt to convince writers and artists all over the country to move to New York so that Harlem could be truly the Mecca of the New Negro. As publishing houses began to open their doors to Black authors because they saw a market in Black authored books on Negro topics, young Harlem Renaissance artists like Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, Gwendolyn Bennett, Aaron Douglas, and Langston Hughes formed a support group together. The group collaborated on Fire, a magazine intended for younger artists like themselves. Instead of the limits on content that face other publications like NAACP's Crisis and Opportunity Magazine, they tackled broader, more uncensored topics like sex and race. Unfortunately, the group was only able to put out a single issue of Fire, with Hughes and Hearst falling out after a failed collaboration on a play called The Mulebone. But by creating this magazine, they had taken a stand on the kind of ideas they wanted to pursue going forward. This was the dawn of the new Negro and promised and new opportunities for Blacks in America. Alan Locke described this new way of thinking in his essay, Into the New Negro. Locke makes the distinction between how African Americans used to be viewed and how that view is changing. Locke stated a renewed race spirit that consciously and proudly set itself apart. Yet artists in the Harlem Renaissance were not unified on the artistic direction or the methods of the movement, but disagreements helped account for the Harlem Renaissance importance. And one of those major disagreements was over the most controversial novels of its age, Nigger Heaven, which was written by a white critic named Carl Van Vechten. Van Vechten believed the novel to be a portrayal of the squalor of Negro life. The plot was a young man who had deserted his true love for an older woman, and then when that woman rejects him for another man, the young man attempts to murder the other man. It was one of the first novels about Harlem and African American life written by a white person, and it virtually served as a tour guide to Harlem, capitalizing on the supposed exotic aspects of Black urban life while focusing primarily on the frustrations of urban African Americans. Harlemites felt that they had been betrayed by Van Vechten, whom they had opened their doors to. W.E.B. Du Bois called it a blow in the face, was not simply offended by the use of the word nigger in the title. Many Blacks were fearful that the portrayal of African Americans in what was perceived as stereotypes would only continue to confirm the racial bias. They wanted literature by and about Blacks to serve as propaganda and to be free from stereotypes and vulgarity, and that too much Blackness, too much street would undermine the Blacks' ability to gain respect and equality from white culture. But not all Blacks agree with this thought. Many of the younger generation of writers and artists had praised Van Vechten's novel, although they hated the use of the word nigger in the title. They felt that the success of Nigger Heaven as a permission for them to celebrate Blackness in all of its manifestations, not just the portrayals approved by the Harlem elite. The Black elite only represented a small fraction of the Black community, and the younger writers felt as though they spoke for the entire population of Harlem. Although vilified by some, Van Vechten became a key contact for several artists and authors because of his interracial parties and his publishing connections. As African American music, especially blues and jazz, became a worldwide sensation, Black music provided the pulse of the Harlem Renaissance. The rise of so-called race records industry began with Okay's recording of Mamie Smith's Crazy Blues in 1920. This spread the blues to audiences previously unfamiliar with the artist's form. Artists like Smith, Alberta Hunter, Clara Smith, Bessie Smith, and Ma Rainey, who had performed for years at circuses, clubs, and tent shows, suddenly found themselves famous. Their music expressed the longings and the perspective of the black working class. Blues was an indigenous art form performed by the country's most oppressed peoples. Out of blues formed jazz, migrating to the North's urban centers such as Chicago and New York during and after World War I. In the 1920s, jazz orchestras grew in size, incorporated new instruments, and as well as methods and performance. Louis Armstrong became the first great jazz soloist when he moved from King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in Chicago to Fletcher Henderson's band in New York City in 1924. Henderson's band soon had plenty of competition, led by the likes of Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington. Once associated with brothels and traveling circuses, jazz had gained respectability as an art form, and dance forms associated with jazz also became popular, with the Charleston and tap dance becoming international fads. Langston Hughes also broke ground in poetry with a style of poetry called jazz poetry, in which rhyme of the poem was spoken aloud mirrors the sound that jazz would make. He led this way of harnessing jazz form and poetry with the Weary Blues, which was written in 1923. And jazz poetry is one of the early predecessors to contemporary rap music. With Harlem being the center of the jazz age, the Harlem Speakeasy was the epicenter of it all because that's where the jazz was. It was the kind of music that speakeasy owners loved because it kept customers dancing and it kept them buying drinks. And by far, the hottest club in Harlem was the Savoy. When it opened in March 1927, 4,000 people from all walks of life showed up. The Savoy Ballroom spanned the entire block from Lenox Avenue between 140th to 144th Street. Patrons paid 40 cents to $1 to enter the club, and unlike most clubs, the Savoy had two bandstands that kept the music playing nonstop. In its heyday, big names and big band jazz would play at the Savoy Club, from Louis Armstrong to Cab Calloway to Duke Ellington to King Oliver. This popularity of jazz among whites helped spark the Negro Vogue. It was fashionable to visit nightclubs in Harlem. Ironically, it was Carl Van Etchens whose music criticism helped push the significance of jazz and blues, and his novel Nigger Heaven, which helped spread the idea of Negro Vogue outside of Harlem. And nowhere was Negro Vogue more evident than in nightclubs. But that didn't mean that white people actually wanted to socialize with blacks. Consequently, a whole industry of black clubs arose, offering the exoticness of black people, but at a distance. The most famous of these white establishments was the Cotton Club, located on 142nd Street near Lenox Ave. The Cotton Club was owned by a gangster named Oney Killer Madden. He opened up the club in 1923, shortly after Madden completed a prison sentence for murder. Ironically, white socialites felt more comfortable rubbing elbows with a murderer than blacks they traveled to Harlem for. The Cotton Club had a log cabin exterior with an interior that featured a jungle decor. Their band leader was Cab Calloway. He would go on to discuss the club, stating that the bandstand was a replica of a southern mansion with large white columns and a backdrop painted with weeping willows and slave quarters. The waiters were dressed in red tuxedos like butlers in a southern mansion, and once inside, the patrons would dance on the dance floor or watch an all-black revue from the distance of cafe tables. With whites coming to Harlem in unprecedented numbers, blacks felt like they had found acceptance. It didn't matter that whites were heading to segregated clubs from which they were excluded because they were playing our music and performers came to see us. They reveled in the change in status after years of having been ignored and overlooked, and many believed that the acceptance of jazz and the increased visibility of black culture were some of the first steps to becoming true citizens in the United States. While music was gaining acceptance in black theater was much tougher. American theater had traditionally portrayed African Americans in a very narrow sense without any real connection to black culture or its arts. In American theater, the basic black character was a childlike, slow-moving victim of his base desires, and the minstrel show would make themselves up in huge lips and would suggest cavernous mouths. These stereotypes were created and played by white actors who applied blackface or blacked it up with burnt cork. African Americans were portrayed on stage as either a comic or pathetic. And this changed a bit in the 1920s when dramatic roles on stage exploded for African Americans. During the decade, numerous plays, still written and produced by whites, but presented unprecedented opportunity for blacks to perform serious roles in drama in downtown theaters. Plays like Paul Green's Abram Blossom and Edward Sheldon and Charles MacArthur's Lulu Bell and Mark Connolly's Greener Pastures epitomized this movement amongst white playwrights. Many blacks were, of course, disappointed by these productions. These plays were about blacks' life, but they were written exclusively by whites, produced by whites, for a white audience. The portrayals of blacks in these productions was not as complex as initially seemed. Many of these roles were limited to stereotypes of childlike sentiment and seemed to be no better than the minstrel stereotypes. Nevertheless, Harlem residents came to accept these shows at least for economic reasons. These productions featured large casts which offered job opportunities more rewarding than usual labor jobs. The only black author drama to make it to Broadway during the decade, Wallace Thurman's and William Rapp's play Harlem in 1929. And as is still true today, African American community was much harsher on their own, expecting black playwrights to know better than to stoop to the tastes of white audiences. While whites controlled legitimate theater, African Americans made headway in musicals. They wrote and produced and performed them, and the most noteworthy of these musicals was Shuffle Along, written by Cissy Noble and U.B. Blake in 1921, which opened off-Broadway and was hugely popular. It was showed more than 500 times during the decade. James Weldon Johnson called it the single most important event in the entire history of black theater. It wasn't that it was that much different from old minstrel shows with blacked up white comedians. The major difference is that blacks profited alongside whites because black actors were used and the plays were progressive in their music and dance. Shuffle Along is an example of how the system had both changed for the better and the worse in American theater. Those in the New Negro movement hungered for an authentic African American theater that didn't play up to stereotypes. The black intellectuals recognized that Broadway black identity was more of a projection of whites' perception and didn't reflect them at all. Consequently, the New Negro movement became committed to establishing a theater experience constructed for and about African Americans. One of the earliest to speak out for legitimate theater was African American playwright Willis Richardson. He wanted to see plays that captured the richness, diversity, and beauty of black people. Richardson called for a national Negro theater, and during the 20s, Richardson wrote 6 one-act plays that anchored in the realism and relied on ordinary blacks who suffered from their own weakness and society's shortcomings. W.E.B. Du Bois echoed Richardson's belief and articulated this in the crisis which he laid out 4 principles for Negro theater. Those 4 principles are about us. They must have plots which reveal Negro life as it is. By us, that is. They must be written by Negro authors who understand from birth and continuously associated from what it means to be a Negro today. For us, that is. Theaters must cater primarily to Negro audiences and must be supported and sustained by their entertainment and approval. And near us, the theater must be in a Negro neighborhood near the mass of ordinary Negro people. W.E.B. Du Bois founded the Quinoa Players and the Harlem Experimental Stock Company that performed plays in the basement of the 135th Street Branch Library. Built on these 4 principles, their goal was to focus on creating, nurturing, developing, and promoting new writers, directors, performers, and actors within the black community. While these stock companies produced amazing plays and developed some excellent actors, these companies could not compete with the lure and financial power of Broadway or vaudeville and found themselves constantly looking and needing performers. In the early 20th century, if you were black and wanted to display your artwork, there was simply no place to do it. In Europe, African American artists and galleries displayed their work, but in the United States, African Americans were not simply discouraged from the visual arts, they were completely frozen out. Most art schools refused to accept black students, and art galleries and museums did not display their work. White organizations that did focus on black issues believed that African Americans needed to devote their time, energy, and effort to uplifting their economic status and not wasting their time on trivial pursuits like fine arts. One of the first to break this exile was Meta Warwick Fuller. She created a sculpture that represented African heritage, ethnic pride, and their folk background. Her most famous work was Ethiopia Awakening in 1914 and Mary Turner, A Silent Protest Against Mob Violence in 1919. It was some of the earliest examples of American art that was influenced by African sculpture. The sculpture also challenged the racist social climate of the world. By 1920, Fuller's work had inspired both E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke to champion African American and African art. Art was used to express the new Negro identity, but it also was used as a response to whites who felt that blacks could neither create nor had any business creating art. They saw this as an important tool in shaping Americans' consciousness about blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois described his hopes for creation of a new image of African Americans through art. Meta Warwick Fuller was the first to realize that African Americans' desires in her sculptures, during which the Renaissance prominent blacks sought to discover and influence through others' artwork and depiction of African American pride. While Fuller set the stage for the artistic renaissance in Harlem by exploring African and African American themes in her art, but an artist by the name of Aaron Douglas was the official artist of the Harlem Renaissance and the father of the Black American art. Alan Locke called him the pioneering Africanist. Douglas was without question the most celebrated and most successful Harlem visual artist in 1920. He was lured to New York by James Woodin Johnson, and soon after arriving, a German artist by the name of Weinhold Rice challenged Douglas to share his academic style and look at the designs of African art. The work that resulted came to embody all that is the Harlem Renaissance stood for and the culturally rich aspects of African life and heritage. His exploration of African aesthetics and use of black things brought him to the attention of very important people within Harlem. W.B. Du Bois hired him to often illustrate covers and interior pages of the NAACP's The Crisis, and James Woodin Johnson did the same with The Opportunity, and major book publishing companies asked him to illustrate a number of important books like Carl Van Etchen's Nigger Heaven. All good things must come to an end. Throughout all this progress in the 1920s, in October 29th, 1929, marked the end of the 20s and the beginning of the Great Depression. This was the day that the stock market crashed. And the weeks after, it seemed like only investors in the market would be affected. The people of Harlem would look at the crash at a distance because most African Americans didn't own stock. They viewed the crash as a white problem. African Americans saw the irony in the newspaper calling it Black Tuesday, and that now whites would learn what it's like to be poor and black in America. Some of the first to feel the effects of the Great Depression were black laborers who worked low-paying jobs and paid high rent in Harlem. The phrase last hired, first fired came to mean black workers would lose their jobs before white workers would. And the median income in Harlem would drop 43% from 1808 to just 1019, with unemployment in Harlem being 5 times as high as other parts of the city and reaching almost 50%. Harlem changed from an oasis of black pride to a slum, which 2 to 3 families lived in the single apartment buildings, and which the buildings became so run down because they were stressed with too many tenants. Langston Hughes would write, "We were no longer in vogue anyway, we are Negroes." By 1935, no one from the Harlem Renaissance early days still lived in Harlem. The economic fallout from the Depression was one of the biggest reasons for the decline, but wasn't the sole cause. Throughout the Renaissance, cracks existed under the surface. These divisions was easily overlooked when money and recognition were plentiful, but once those opportunities disappeared, the Renaissance began to divide clearly into two camps, with young artists believing that art should celebrate blackness in all its variety and truth and be truthful to life, whereas older, more established artists felt that it should function as a propaganda machine and uplift the status of African Americans. The defining moment of this divide was the play Harlem. Older artists felt like it was a slap in the face, and it shined a light on rent parties and bootleg liquor and gambling. Many in the new Negro black intellectual movement would rather have gone unknown to the white population. Although these issues had nothing to do with the Great Depression, it made it impossible for African Americans in the face of economic disaster to fight as a unified front, and consequently, the Harlem Renaissance disintegrated and its participants scattered into parts. This is where my story ends, but that is not where the story ends. The decline of the Harlem Renaissance was not the end of the Black Renaissance. From a period roughly from the 1930s into the 1950s, Chicago was Black America's most cultural capital. The Great Depression hit the nation hard, jobs were scarce, yet tens of thousands of hopeful migrants continued to pour into Chicago looking to better their lives. Through this hardship of the Great Depression, formed new forms of activism, art, and thought, and featured some ex-Harlemites playing critical roles in this Black movement. The Black community was continuing to change beyond the decline of the Harlem Renaissance, and those changes were reflected in the works of 20th century's most talented artists during the time period known as the Black Renaissance. Thank you for listening. My name is Country Boy. This has been One Mic Black History, a Black History podcast. If you like this, if you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page. I've linked that in the description. Also, if you like this, please review us on Apple Podcasts. Give us 5 stars. And lastly, listen to The Cut for all your pop culture needs. And peace.